I wasn't ready for that. It was just too much of a jump for me, and my career stalled. So I went to junior college and started playing pretty well for a few months, and then I hurt my hand. I tore a ligament in my left hand. I was playing first base at the time. And the Dodgers had been watching me, and Tommy had been talking to my father, and they're like, "Look, let's draft him and see if he gets healthy, and if maybe he'll go back to school, and we can watch him like a draft and follow."
Mike Piazza became one of baseball's greatest hitting catchers, but one broken bat helped create the kind of feud that makes people think, "He makes me sick." He was picked in the 62nd round of the 1988 draft, the 1,390th player chosen that year, and many people saw that pick as a favor to his family from Dodgers manager Tommy Lasorda. Nobody expected much from a player selected that low. Almost nobody outside his own family believed he would ever make the major leagues at all. Piazza took that insult and turned it into fuel, and he used that fuel for the rest of his career, in ways that helped him and in ways that hurt him too. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icons. He trained hard under his father, Vince Piazza, who built an entire program around hitting, almost to the exclusion of everything else in the game. That narrow, demanding focus paid off fast. Piazza hit 35 home runs as a rookie in 1993, a number that shocked the entire league. He batted an incredible .362 in 1997, one of the best single-season averages any catcher has ever posted. Those numbers put him among the greatest offensive catchers the sport has ever produced, a player who changed what teams expected a man behind the plate to do with a bat in his hands. But the same fire that built his career also made him hold on to anger for a very long time. He kept a mental list of every insult, every hard pitch thrown near his body, and every unkind word said about him in public. Most players let these things fade with time. Piazza did not. Across 16 seasons in the major leagues, that list only grew longer, and some of the names on it never came off. Today we look at 5 players Piazza never fully forgave. Some of these fights involved real physical danger, the kind that could have ended a career or worse. Others grew out of hurt feelings, personality clashes, contract disputes, or wounded pride. None of them were simple, and none of them faded away quietly on their own. We are going to count them down from number 5 to number 1, and we will end with the biggest and most famous feud of his entire career. One that played out in front of the whole country on the sport's biggest stage. If this story already has you fired up, use the hype feature and give this video some hype as we break down the 5 names Piazza could never seem to leave behind. Before we get into the list itself, it helps to understand why Piazza reacted to conflict the way that he did. He was never simply handed anything in this sport. Every single level of his career felt like something he had to fight and claw for, starting with that 62nd round selection that people openly called a courtesy pick for years afterward. That feeling of being overlooked never really left him, even long after he had become one of the biggest stars in the entire league. It shaped how he saw criticism from reporters. It shaped how he saw hard, dangerous pitches thrown near his body. And it shaped how he saw teammates or former teammates who spoke badly about him in public. To Piazza, none of these were small, forgettable things. They were reminders that people still doubted him, and every single time, he answered that doubt by refusing to simply let it go. This countdown is built entirely from documented history, not from guesswork or invented drama. We are not going to put words directly into Piazza's mouth that he never actually said, and we are not going to pretend that every single one of these conflicts unfolded exactly the same way. Some of them involved real, serious physical danger between 2 grown men standing on a baseball field. Others involved nothing more than harsh words, wounded pride, or simple personality clashes that never once turned physical at all. What ties every single one of them together is not violence at all. What ties them together is Piazza's own long memory and his lifelong habit of treating disrespect in any form as something deeply personal that always deserved a response. Number 5 is Brett Butler. In the spring of 1998, Piazza was locked in a tense fight with the Los Angeles Dodgers over a brand new contract. The team had just been bought by Fox, a large corporate media company, and the negotiations quickly turned tense and very public. Almost every single day seemed to bring a fresh headline about how much money Piazza wanted and whether the new ownership group would actually be willing to pay it. That is exactly when Brett Butler, an outfielder who had just recently retired from the game, sat down for an interview with the Los Angeles Times. Butler had spent many years in the major leagues, and he had a reputation as a scrappy, hard-nosed, old-school kind of player, the type who valued grinding out at bats and playing the game a certain traditional way. That background made his comments about Piazza carry extra weight with fans and reporters who saw him as a credible, experienced voice from inside the game. Butler did not hold back at all. He described Piazza in that interview as a moody, self-centered 90s player, a phrase that spread through the sports pages almost immediately. In that same interview, Butler also said something far kinder about Piazza. He said Piazza was the single greatest hitter he had ever personally been around in his entire career. But then he added a much harder point right afterward. He said that a franchise simply could not be built around a player like Piazza, because in Butler's view, Piazza was missing the leadership qualities a true team needed from its biggest star. Piazza did not take these comments as simply one retired player sharing an honest opinion. He believed there was something bigger going on behind the scenes. In his mind, the front office wanted to slowly turn the fan base against him, so that trading him away would look reasonable and easy to accept once it finally happened. It is worth saying clearly here that the research does not actually prove that Butler was working together with the front office on purpose. That idea about a planned and coordinated smear campaign came entirely from Piazza's own personal point of view on the situation. Still, whether it was planned that way or not, the words landed at about the worst possible moment they possibly could have. Dodgers fans started booing Piazza at home games not long after that interview came out. Around that same period, the legendary broadcaster Vin Scully had also interviewed Piazza directly about his looming contract deadline, and Piazza felt that those pointed questions were really a public loyalty test, one designed to make him look greedy in front of the very fans who had cheered for him for years. To make matters even more difficult, manager Bill Russell, who had taken over the Dodgers dugout back in June of 1996, did little in Piazza's eyes to shield him from all of this swirling front office pressure. Piazza felt that Russell failed to protect him from internal politics and from leaked details about his own contract talks, right at the exact moment he needed support the most. The overall mood surrounding the team turned sour rather quickly, and Piazza felt like the ground itself was shifting underneath him with every passing week. Just a few weeks after Butler's comments made headlines, in May of 1998, the Dodgers pulled off one of the biggest trades in franchise history. They sent Piazza to the Florida Marlins, ending his time in Los Angeles for good, in a trade that stunned much of the baseball world. Piazza saw Butler's public comments as an outright betrayal, plain and simple, and nothing less than that. In his mind, players were supposed to protect one another from outside pressure, not hand fresh ammunition to the very people running the team behind the scenes. A former teammate speaking badly about him at the worst possible moment felt, to Piazza, like a complete breach of clubhouse loyalty. This entire episode is one of the clearest examples in Piazza's whole career of how he treated public criticism as something far bigger than simple disagreement between two grown men. He saw it instead as disloyalty, plain and simple, and that particular feeling followed him for years afterward, long after he had already left Los Angeles behind for a brand new city and a brand new team. For a player who already felt like an outsider from the very start of his career, watching that trust break down in front of the entire country made the pain of the Butler comments cut even deeper. Even Piazza's warm relationship with Tommy Lasorda, the very man who had helped bring him into professional baseball in the first place, took damage during this same stretch. Piazza later felt that comments Lasorda made after the trade showed his old mentor choosing loyalty to the organization over their own personal friendship, which only deepened the sense that Los Angeles as a whole had turned on him. Number 4 is Jeff Kent. Jeff Kent played second base for the New York Mets from 1992 all the way through 1996, and that timeline is important to understand right from the very start. Piazza did not actually join the Mets organization until 1998, a full 2 years after Kent had already moved on to a different team entirely. So this particular conflict was never really about the two of them clashing inside one shared Mets clubhouse day after day, season after season. It was something quite different from that. It was a personality conflict that grew almost entirely from a distance, built on reputation and second-hand impressions rather than daily contact, And it never fully cooled down over time. Even years later, long after both men had moved on to other teams and other chapters of their careers, Kent's name still carried weight around the league. And baseball fans continued to discuss the two players in the same breath whenever conversations turned to prickly clubhouse personalities. Kent developed a strong reputation around the league as a highly productive player who was also blunt, surly, and genuinely hard for people to warm up to. Reporters who covered baseball closely during that era often described him as someone who said exactly what he was thinking, whether the people around him wanted to hear it or not. Piazza, for his own part, openly admitted in later interviews that he himself could also be moody and emotionally distant, especially whenever things were not going particularly well for him or for his team. Two strong, proud, and genuinely sensitive personalities like that do not always mix easily, even from a distance and even without any daily contact between them, and these two clearly did not mix well at all. Kent eventually moved on from the Mets organization entirely, and he went on to reach an MVP caliber level of play with the San Francisco Giants a few years later. His continued success on a completely different team did very little to soften how Piazza actually felt about him deep down. If anything at all, it seemed to make absolutely no difference whatsoever to Piazza's lingering feelings. In his 2013 autobiography titled Long Shot, Piazza specifically named Kent as someone he had no warm feelings left for, and someone he had no real interest in ever patching things up with, even many years after both of their playing careers had already come to an end. There was no broken bat anywhere in this particular story. There was no fastball thrown directly at his head, and there was no dramatic charge toward a pitcher standing on the mound. This entire conflict was simply a clash of two strong personalities who rubbed each other the wrong way, built on reputation and distance rather than one single explosive on-field event. Part of the friction, according to the research, came down to a quiet competition for clubhouse influence and media attention during a period when the Mets organization itself was going through real change. Two proud, driven players do not always share the spotlight easily, even when they never actually share a locker room at the same time. And yet the underlying grudge lasted for years anyway, which really shows something important about Piazza. He clearly did not need a violent, dramatic moment in order to hold on to real, lasting resentment for a very long time afterward. It is a good reminder that not every lasting grudge in sports needs a dramatic highlight reel moment behind it. Sometimes two people simply do not get along, and that alone can be enough to last a lifetime. That larger question of how a grudge could possibly last for years without a single big blow-up moment behind it leads us directly to our next name on this countdown, someone whose personal issue with Piazza actually went all the way back to family loyalty, old organizational wounds, and a genuinely large amount of money. Number 3 is Pedro Martinez. Piazza and Pedro Martinez both actually started out with the very same organization, the Los Angeles Dodgers, and they even made their official major league debuts during the exact same month, back in September of 1992. From the outside looking in, that shared beginning might sound like the start of a natural friendship built on common experience. Instead, their relationship was strained from remarkably early on, and the underlying reasons went well beyond anything that happened on the baseball field itself. Pedro's older brother, Ramon Martinez, had also pitched for the Dodgers organization for a number of years, and Pedro genuinely felt that the team had not treated his older brother fairly during his time there. That deep feeling of mistreatment stuck with Pedro for a very long time afterward, and it shaped how he saw the entire Dodgers organization for years to come, including the players who seemed to benefit most from the system his brother felt wronged by. Meanwhile, during that same period, Piazza was rising quickly through the very same organization, and he had built an especially close, almost family-like relationship with longtime manager Tommy Lasorda. To Pedro, watching a much younger player receive that kind of special treatment and support from the very same organization that he felt had failed his brother was not something that was easy to simply brush aside. Without either young player necessarily choosing it themselves, that particular connection placed Piazza directly on the opposite side of Pedro's long-running dispute with the Dodgers front office. As both players eventually became major stars while playing for entirely different teams, the underlying tension between them did not fade away with time. It actually grew stronger instead. Martinez publicly criticized Piazza's contract demands during several interviews over the years, suggesting at times that Piazza seemed more focused on chasing money than on simply playing the game the right way. Piazza, for his own part, never particularly enjoyed stepping into the batter's box against Martinez, who was widely known throughout the league for throwing pitches up and in, dangerously close to a hitter's hands and sometimes even close to a hitter's head. That specific kind of aggressive pitching style tends to create real tension between hitters and pitchers, even in cases without any deep personal history behind it at all. Then, after the now well-known 2003 spring training incident involving relief pitcher Guillermo Mota, which we are going to cover in full detail very shortly, Martinez asked a pointed and very public question about Piazza's behavior. He wondered out loud in front of reporters why Piazza apparently had no problem at all charging directly at the much smaller Mota, who weighed somewhere around 190 pounds, yet stayed completely calm and motionless when the much larger and far more physically imposing Roger Clemens had stood on the mound in a previous, far more dangerous moment. It was a direct and pointed challenge aimed squarely at Piazza's overall consistency, and it was clearly meant to sting. Martinez's question stuck around in the sport's collective memory precisely because it came from a fellow star, someone who understood exactly what it meant to face real danger on a baseball field, rather than from a reporter simply looking to stir up controversy from the outside. Then something rather unexpected happened between these two long-running rivals. In 2005, the Mets organization, under general manager Omar Minaya, signed Martinez to a large, multi-year free agent contract, and suddenly Piazza and Martinez found themselves as teammates on the exact same roster. The two men worked together in a professional, business-like way for that single shared season together in New York. This certainly did not mean that every hard feeling between them simply disappeared overnight, the way some fans might have hoped. It showed something else entirely instead, something arguably bigger than their own shared personal history together. It showed clearly how modern professional sports can force long-time rivals to share the very same clubhouse and work toward the very same shared goal, whether the two men involved have truly made peace with one another deep down or not. Over the course of his own long career, Martinez won 219 games, posted a career earned run average of 2.93, and struck out 3,154 batters, numbers that made him one of the most feared and respected pitchers of his entire generation, and made his public words about Piazza carry even more weight with fans watching from home. Piazza's very next explosion of anger did not happen on baseball's biggest possible stage, in front of millions of people watching around the country. Instead, it happened in a spring training game that barely mattered at all in the actual standings, against a far less famous and far less celebrated opponent than the ones we have discussed so far. Number 2 is Guillermo Mota. This particular feud first began back in the spring of 2002. Mota, who was pitching for the Los Angeles Dodgers organization at the time, hit Piazza directly in the hip with a pitch during a fairly routine exhibition game. Piazza did not simply shake off the impact and calmly walk down to first base the way that many other hitters typically would have done in that exact same situation. Instead, he confronted Mota directly near the visiting team's own dugout, and he actually grabbed him firmly by the front of his jersey before teammates from both opposing sides quickly rushed in to physically pull the two men apart from each other. The much bigger and far more famous moment between these two men came about a full year later, specifically on March 12, 2003, in Port St. Lucie, Florida, during another round of Mets spring training. The Mets were losing rather badly to the Dodgers on that particular afternoon, trailing by a wide margin of 10-1 in the bottom of the sixth inning, in a game that genuinely meant almost nothing at all for either team's actual regular season. Mota threw an inside pitch that narrowly missed hitting Piazza's hip once again, close enough that it drew visible frustration from the experienced veteran catcher standing at the plate. On the very next pitch that followed immediately after, Mota ended up hitting Piazza directly in the shoulder. By that point, Piazza had already been hit by a Mota pitch once before, back during that earlier spring training confrontation in 2002, so this was not the first time these two men had clashed over an inside pitch. Piazza did not hesitate for even a single second this time around. He dropped his bat immediately onto the ground and charged straight toward the pitcher's mound, fully ready for a real physical confrontation with Mota. Mota, however, chose not to stand his ground and actually face him directly. Instead, he threw his own fielding glove toward the charging Piazza and quickly turned to run in the completely opposite direction. retreating all the way back toward the empty outfield grass behind him. Mets manager Art Howe later joked publicly about the entire moment, comparing Mota to a frightened, scared rabbit, who could apparently move backward faster than most ordinary people could even run forward under normal circumstances. Baseball as a sport has always allowed a certain accepted amount of aggressive inside pitching, treating it as a somewhat unwritten but generally accepted part of the game's own internal culture. Pitchers moving hitters off the plate a little, or even intentionally hitting a batter once in a while to send a competitive message, has long been considered a normal part of baseball's own internal system of self-policing between players. But hitting a future Hall of Fame caliber hitter not once but twice, in a completely meaningless spring training game with absolutely nothing at stake, crossed a clear line for a great many people watching that particular game unfold that day, including several of Piazza's own teammates and coaches standing nearby. Spring training games exist mainly so players can get their timing and their conditioning ready for the long season ahead, not to settle old scores or send dangerous messages, which is exactly why so many people around the sport viewed Mota's second pitch as reckless rather than as a normal, accepted part of the game. Piazza's visible anger in that specific moment makes a certain amount of understandable sense, especially given that he had now been struck multiple separate times by the very same relief pitcher within roughly a single year's time. Still, it remains worth pausing here to genuinely ask why a relatively minor spring training scuffle against a middle relief pitcher stayed important enough to remain a real part of his personal story for years and years afterward, especially given how differently he had reacted in a much bigger, far more dangerous moment against a considerably more physically threatening opponent. Years later, in 2006, the New York Mets organization actually went ahead and brought Mota onto their own major league roster specifically to help strengthen a struggling bullpen, long after Piazza himself had already left the team entirely to go play for the San Diego Padres. Mota went on to help the Mets during a genuinely strong stretch that eventually included winning a full division title that season, but his overall time in New York was later overshadowed by two entirely separate suspensions for performance-enhancing drugs, along with a handful of difficult and disappointing postseason outings that Mets fans still clearly remember to this very day. Across his own career, which ran from 1999 to 2012, Mota won 39 games, posted a career earned run average of 3.94, and struck out 696 batters, numbers that made him a solid, workmanlike relief pitcher, but never the kind of star whose name alone would explain why Piazza reacted so violently to him in the first place. One rival pitcher on another team took clear notice of the obvious gap between how instantly and aggressively Piazza reacted to Mota and how dramatically differently he had handled the far more dangerous man standing at the very center of our next, and by far, the single biggest feud on this entire countdown list. That gap became one of the most talked about contradictions of Piazza's entire career, and it set up perfectly the final chapter of this story. Every name so far on this list has shown a different side of Piazza's long memory, from wounded pride to personality conflict to instant physical retaliation. But nothing compares to the final name on this countdown, the one rivalry that followed Piazza for his entire time in New York, and the one moment that baseball fans still bring up decades later whenever his career gets discussed. Number 1 is Roger Clemens. Before things ever turned genuinely ugly between the two of them, Piazza had actually enjoyed real, consistent success facing Clemens directly out on the field of play. He hit a 3-run home run off of Clemens at Shea Stadium during one particularly memorable interleague matchup between the Mets and the Yankees, and he later went on to hit a full grand slam against Clemens at Yankee Stadium in a completely separate game as well. These were not small, forgettable moments by any stretch of the imagination. They were exactly the kind of dramatic hits that publicly embarrassed an intensely proud and normally dominant pitcher directly in front of a huge national television audience. Interleague play was still a relatively new part of baseball at the time, and matchups between the Mets and the Yankees drew enormous attention across all of New York City, meaning every single meeting between Piazza and Clemens carried extra weight and extra pressure for both men involved. Clemens, for his part, had built his entire legendary career around raw power, precise control, and pure old-fashioned intimidation. He was famous league-wide for pitching aggressively inside against hitters, and for deliberately making opposing batters feel physically uncomfortable while standing in the batter's box. Losing repeatedly to Piazza, again and again in such a highly public and embarrassing way, seemed to genuinely eat away at Clemens more and more with every single new meeting between their two respective teams. Real tension between these two proud competitors had clearly been building for quite some time, long before anything actually physical eventually happened out on the field itself. Across his long career, which stretched from 1984 all the way to 2007, Clemens won 354 games, posted a career earned run average of 3.12, and struck out an astonishing 4,672 batters. Numbers that made him one of the most dominant and celebrated pitchers the sport of baseball has ever seen. That level of greatness is exactly why so many people found his explanations after the fact so hard to simply accept at face value. Everything between them changed dramatically on July 8, 2000. During an otherwise routine regular season interleague game played between the Mets and the Yankees. A Clemens fastball struck Piazza directly and forcefully in the helmet, and the sheer force of that impact caused a concussion serious enough that Piazza was forced to miss that entire year's All-Star game as a direct result. This was absolutely not a small or minor scare by any measure. It was a real, deeply frightening injury that ultimately kept him sidelined from the very game he loved for a number of difficult weeks afterward. Piazza flatly refused to accept the simple idea that this had merely been an accident, just a single wayward pitch that had unfortunately gotten away from an otherwise careful pitcher. He argued quite publicly and repeatedly that a pitcher possessing Clemens's extraordinary level of skill and pinpoint control should never miss his intended target by that dangerously wide of a margin, especially while aiming so uncomfortably close to a hitter's unprotected head. Piazza further stated that if a pitcher truly wanted to send a tough, competitive message by throwing aggressively inside, the correct and considerably safer target to aim for was always a batter's back, and never an area of the body that could realistically end someone's entire career or even potentially threaten their life. Clemens later attempted to personally apologize to Piazza over the telephone soon afterward, but Piazza flatly refused to accept that apology, and whatever small amount of remaining professional respect had existed between the two proud men seemed to completely disappear at that exact point going forward. To understand why Piazza reacted so strongly, it helps to think about what a pitch to the head really means in baseball. A fastball is a heavy, fast-moving object, and a direct hit to an unprotected part of the head can end a career in a single instant, or cause damage that lasts a lifetime. Most players understand that pitchers sometimes throw inside on purpose, as a way of keeping hitters honest and pushing them back from the plate. That is considered a normal, accepted part of the game. But a pitch that actually connects with a batter's helmet is treated very differently, because the margin between a message and a tragedy is razor thin. None of these 5 separate conflicts were simply random accidents that happened to fall into Piazza's life by pure chance alone. They all connect directly back to one much larger ongoing story, the story of a talented player who spent his entire professional career trying tirelessly to prove every single doubter around him wrong, starting all the way back with a 62nd round draft pick that almost nobody outside of his own immediate family genuinely believed in at the time. It is worth pointing out that this same pattern of feeling disrespected also showed up with people beyond just these 5 names. Piazza reportedly felt that longtime Mets public relations director Jay Horwitz did not do enough to shield him from the aggressive New York tabloid press, especially during one strange and uncomfortable media cycle in 2002. And later on, Piazza came to believe that Mets general manager Omar Minaya wanted to push him out of New York entirely, even though there were no real public trade talks to support that particular feeling. None of these extra examples replace the 5 main names on our list today, but together they help paint a much fuller and richer picture of just how often Piazza interpreted the world around him through the narrow lens of disrespect. That same relentless, driving motivation eventually helped turn him into a Don's .308 career hitter with 427 total home runs and 1,335 runs batted in across 1,912 total games played over the course of his career. Look at that full career, from a family courtesy pick in the 62nd round all the way through 5 different major league teams, and you can see both sides of the same coin clearly laid out in front of you. The doubt he faced early on pushed him to work harder than almost anyone else around him. The same doubt carried forward for years and years, also made it difficult for him to ever fully trust the people around him, whether they were opposing pitchers, former teammates, or the writers covering his every move. At the very same time, that exact same powerful drive also made it genuinely difficult for him to simply let things go entirely, whether the original offense came from a rival opposing pitcher, a former teammate, or even a member of the sports media covering him. His long, carefully kept list of grudges may well have made his own personal journey through the sport feel considerably heavier than it truly needed to be at various points along the way, weighing on him long after the games themselves had ended. But that same lingering chip on his shoulder, the very one that made him so genuinely difficult to ever fully satisfy, is also exactly what carried him from a 1,390th overall draft pick that almost nobody expected anything from at all the way to a bronze plaque hanging proudly in Cooperstown, standing today among the single greatest players that the entire game of baseball has ever known. In the end, the same fire that made Mike Piazza so hard to forgive is the very same fire that made him impossible for anyone on any team to ever count out.